You're right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another edition of Scaleway Sessions. My name is Dan. I'm the head of developer relations here at Scaleway. And unlike last week, and unlike all the other previous weeks, I'm actually going to be the one driving the scenes today, making the buttons go, making the sound effects, making the tippy tappy and the scrolly and the commenty. And so I am going to shut up and let Eli and Diego introduce themselves and the rest of the show.
Hello, I'm Eli. I'm one of the developer advocates here at Scaleway. If you've been watching these streams, then you already know that. Today, we're going to be talking about Python, and therefore I am wearing my Pythonista shirt from Hudson River Trading. Great folks. If you're watching this, I'm assuming you're not at PyCon US, like me, feeling the FOMO. But if for some reason you are, stop watching the stream and go say hi to the HRT folks, because they're great.
Great. Hello, I'm Diego, developer advocate here at Scaleway. I do not have any Python swag, but yeah, I'm here willing to enjoy all of these new and refreshing topics that we will discuss today.
Cool. I was just checking my Twitter because various of my friends are at PyCon today, and I've been telling them to go and find each other and go and become friends at PyCon. So this is me sort of trying to exert my influence from the other side of the globe. And one of them just messaged me saying, I need to just wear a shirt saying Eli sent me. Yeah, so I mean that's kind of the big thing going on right now in Python. And I went last year and it was great. And one of the big things that there's doing a lot of talks about at the moment is this new technology called PyScript, which is you take CPython and you compile it down to WebAssembly. And that's the Pyodide project, has been doing that for ages. And Anaconda's built a load of tooling around it to help you actually run that in the browser, hook that into HTML, and actually build pages with it. So you can be doing all sorts of really cool things, interacting directly with JavaScript and Python, and it's just very, very cool. So I'd kind of like to talk a bit about that today. But really what I'd like to do is sort of, if you guys want to ask me questions about Python times and experience and things like this, and I'll just brain dump at you.
Sounds good. So how did it all get started? How did you get into Python?
My first job out of university, I was writing a lot of C. I was working for a telecoms company, working on a session border controller, which is technology that sits around the edge of your telecoms network and does all kinds of sort of clever routing and analytics and lots of various things. And a lot of that's written in C because you want it to be very fast. But there were various bits of it that were written in Python, and I ended up working on those as part of a project that I was on. And I was like, this is better. This is better than better than writing C. I do still love C. I like it as a sort of, I've got a mathematician brain, so the sort of very precise nature of a lot of it, having to understand why it works the way that it does in order to write good code, I really enjoy. And that's something that has helped me when writing Python, actually, is to have that sort of slightly lower level understanding. But when I left that job, I looked for a job writing Python because I wanted to be doing that more in my day-to-day. And I've been writing Python ever since for work. So I went from there into a startup that was doing, trying to sort of programmatize how we design analog circuitry, analog chips, because that's sort of the current method is you take 6 analog circuit engineers and lock them in a room for 6 months with a lot of coffee and a lot of paper, and they come out with some designs. And so this company had a bunch of analog engineers and a bunch of Python engineers, one of which was me, and was essentially trying to sort of make it a bit more programmatic. So that was really good fun. After that, I did some data engineering, which is obviously a huge site of employment for Python engineers. Data is sort of, you write R, you write Julia, and you write Python. Those are the languages. And from there, I went into developer advocacy, and I'm now here.
What a journey.
Yeah.
How about you, Dan? I know that you speak Python as well.
Yeah, so I got into it basically because I spent a long time as a system administrator, right? Bread and butter of most of my career has been sitting on top of Linux boxes, literally physically on top of them in some cases. And as a result, wrote a lot of C back in the day, a lot of really nasty shell scripts, Perl, wrote a lot of Perl, and one thing led to another, as these things often do, and I ended up getting into Ruby because one of the nice things about Ruby is you can basically just write Perl, right? And then it happens to have some, rub some object orientation on there, and then all of a sudden you have Ruby, right? And so I ended up writing a fair amount of Ruby at a startup, and that startup failed magnificently for reasons unrelated to writing the Ruby. Went to find another job.
Are you sure?
That's what we have to tell ourselves. And go ahead and found another job, and basically rolled up, and they were like, "We see that you've done a lot of sysadmin. We see you've done a lot of Perl. You see this, that, the other thing. Do you know anything about Python?" And I really, really wanted the job, and I really needed the money, and I said yes.
Of course.
Oh yeah.
Many years, yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I've been writing Python for 9 years. Like, great. And there was no whiteboarding, there was none of that, right? So I was, dodged the bullet there. And living in France as I do, there's a 3 months in between jobs minimum, because you have to say goodbye to your old one before you get the new one. So it basically gave me 3 months to learn Python, which I put off until the last possible moment, basically. And a couple of weeks away from starting my new job, I encountered a website, and maybe it still exists. I haven't looked a long time. It's called Python the Hard Way, or Learn Python the Hard Way.
I've actually heard of that, I think. Hang on.
Yeah, and frankly, it was phenomenal. And I basically just binged that site for a couple of weeks, right? In the same way you'd binge like a Netflix series, like Drive to Survive or something like that. I binged Learn Python the Hard Way. And at first I was just doing it because I didn't want to be a liar, and I didn't want to lose my job day one, right? But a few days,
the snake bit you.
Yes, but a few days into the content, I was like, actually, Python's dope.
It's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah, I mean, my first full-time Python job, having dabbled essentially in some 2.7 at my first job, then going and trying to get a job doing it full-time. Obviously, that was at the time not 2.7 anymore, because this was about 5-6 years ago. And I got this interview and went, okay, Python interview gotchas. And I learned all the things about, like, if you've got a function and you've got a default that's a mutable thing, don't do that, because on subsequent calls it can be mutated, and all those things. And that came up in the interview, and I felt very smart for having Googled it. But one of the things about Python is that it's got a very gentle learning curve, actually, I think, in terms of from starting to, hello world to I've built something that's actually useful for me is quite rapid, which makes it really, really good for, if you're just getting into code, or if you need to build something quickly.
I definitely agree. Now I can tell you my story.
Yes.
I learned Python last year. As you may know, I've been a JavaScript developer my whole career. And JavaScript, as you may know, it's like one of the topmost layers. And it was limited to a browser for a long time. Then we got Node, even though we could run JavaScript on the server for a long time, but it wasn't popularized until Node got here. That was fun. JavaScript, it's a whole different world. And I wanted to understand how things worked under the hood. So at some point during my career, I stopped using frameworks and libraries because I wanted to do things the hard way, like understanding how the engine works, really. Which I did. It was a lot. So last year, I wanted some time off from that, and I decided to learn Python because I heard it's quite easy to start with. And I put myself into this situation where I needed to finish this project that I came up with that same day. I only play one game nowadays, a computer game. It's called Dota 2. Some of you may know it. Doesn't matter. So the thing is that I wanted to make my environment do something whenever my character was killed, right? So
Play the oof sound from Roblox or something.
actually, it was like wah wah wah.
Yep.
Right. So that was my goal. Then I realized there's no API. It doesn't. There's no SDK, so the game doesn't expose anything that I can hook up to. So I said, okay, so I can check which pixels are being displayed on my screen at any given point. And if this pixel over here, top right corner, becomes gray, that means my character has been killed. And I can play the wah wah sound. My goal was to do that in one sitting, one single day, a couple of hours during one Saturday night. The crazy thing is that I did it. I was able to do it with Python. That's something that seemed amazing to me, given my circumstances, my current limitations in my mind, where in JavaScript I wanted to do everything myself from scratch without any other libraries. Over here, I decided to just relax and import whatever library is required, and it worked. And that's how I kind of fell in love with this new language that I'm not an expert by far. I'm still learning, but I'm writing less and less JavaScript every single day.
I mean, one of the things I love about it is you don't have to be an expert in order to do some, really cool, really powerful stuff. There's a lot of really interesting tooling. There's so many libraries. And in general, the documentation in Python is pretty good. Obviously, that's going to depend entirely on who maintains what library, but like the core docs for the actual language, I love. I think they're really, really good. And things like Django, one of the really popular web frameworks, just top tier docs, tutorials, all of that stuff. So you aren't left on your own to figure things out, and there's like a really strong community as well. So yeah, what you're saying about sort of watching the pixels on a screen to actually implement your solution reminds me of a video that I saw, or sorry, not a video, a talk I went to by Alex Dunn, he was the opening keynote at NDC London this past year, and I'm going to drop the video in our chat, where he did something very similar but for providing accessibility, and it was like he basically built a product essentially, but it's not an uncommon thing actually to want to do. So it's very cool that you were able to do it so quickly in Python.
I'm so happy right now because talking about Python, a few hours ago, I decided to create a bot that's reading our Twitch messages.
Oh, is
And
that
it's
in
hooked
Python?
up to that screen over there. So one of you send a message over our chat? Just anything like a hello world? Hello world? Oh, there it is.
Oh, and it's got the little, yeah, that's very cool.
It works.
That's
It's
awesome.
amazing. It's amazing. I spent maybe 1 hour on that and it works. That's
Yeah, I
what I
mean,
love about working with Python.
thinking about like little hack projects as well, Raspberry Pi and Python as well is just such a huge area where people are doing some incredible stuff. My last company was Python web tooling company, so building web apps with just Python, and they built a plugin they built a when you flash something onto your Pi, what's that called? The image, the firmware. They built some firmware for the Pico W to be able to connect that up to not just the internet but the web and let it do HTTPS, actual TLS,
Right.
because it's really hard to do that because they
Right.
don't have an internal clock, and so they had to go and write C code to actually but yeah, some really, really cool stuff in the Python world going on.
Yeah, I don't know if I have mentioned that in the past, but I'm really into microcontrollers. Here's just one small sample of my ESP32 devices,
Excellent.
and I only use MicroPython.
Hmm.
That's the other side of it. I'm using Python for my microcontroller hobby.
Yeah,
It's
I've got a
great.
friend at
I love it.
Pymaroni who is constantly doing insane things with MicroPython.
We have a few comments on the chat.
About how good Django is. Yeah. No, I've been fortunate enough to interact with Daniele Procida, who's one of the big Django guys, a few times, and you can every time I read the documentation, it's really good. Obviously, it's the work of many contributors, but I do think that they have such a high quality, and this guy really embodies it, and I think it does a really good job of maintaining that across the project. Yeah, Django is great. Django I used in my data engineering job because it was a Django backend, if you can believe it. A really powerful framework. Yeah, and I've been looking lately at. I want to rebuild my own personal website in Django because I love it. I understand it. I don't know. I want to have a little feedback form on there for when I do talks, and so that people can go, "Oh, your talk sucked. Talk about this next," or whatever. More likely, actually, let me be kind to myself, people go, no, it was pretty good, actually. But you can't, it's hard to do that with a static website generator, or at least I'm not prepared to put in the work to figure out how. So I'm just going to do it in Django. And so I've been looking at, could this be also the way that I get into Kubernetes and I learn to containerize this and put this on a tiny little cluster just for my own education? And looking at that. And it's like, actually, it's really not that complicated necessarily. Which is partly to do with how good the tooling around containerization is these days, but also to do with the fact that Django is actually just really good and not that complicated and quite user-friendly for beginners, which is another thing about the same thing as Python in general. You can get to, I built a website in a shockingly short amount of time.
Great. Yeah. I was working on a NoCoDB integration. We have talked about NoCoDB in the past for one of our internal tools to track our developer relations activities. So we use another different internal company tool to track tasks and all that. But we in DevRel wanted to use NoCoDB because it makes more sense for what we have in mind. But we still wanted to let the rest of the company know what we're doing. So fortunately, both of those tools have APIs and webhooks integrations. So I was able to create a Flask server to receive the notifications from the webhook sent from NoCoDB and then notify that back to our internal company tool. And it worked. It took sort of a week, but it worked. And this is amazing. You can get things into production quite fast without that much effort. Mm-hmm. I love it.
Yeah,
that's one of the things that's really attractive, I think, about Python is exactly that, is you can go from rapid prototype to rapid production in one sort of smooth step, right? There's a lot of languages that will get you to rapid prototype relatively quickly, but not to production as quickly, right? I'm thinking of some, I don't want to say the word esoteric, I was about to say esoteric, and then I'm going to get people popping off on me on social media.
No, that's my favorite thing. How dare you?
Right, yeah, exactly.
Mind you, there's that counterbalance by the fact that developers love to be into weird stuff. And if you say their thing is niche, then they get clout for being into a niche thing.
For sure, exactly. Yeah. And so I'm thinking in particular of like, actually the inverse case. The inverse case is even more interesting, right? Something like, say, Elixir, right? Which, coming from a Ruby background, I'm like, oh, let's check out Elixir because it looks just like Ruby. And the learning curve there is staggering. So there's no rapid prototyping. At least there wasn't. I mean, maybe it's better now, but a couple of years ago when I was more in that scene, there was no rapid prototyping. You basically just had to do all the work, and then you had something that was production ready.
That right? Feels like C to me a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
How fast are the debug loops with that as well? Because that's something else that's generally pretty good with Python. I think Rust has got it beat in terms of like the error messages and things, but.
But Rust is designed from the ground up like that. But another nice thing about Python is you have that you can just pop yourself into a REPL, right? And if you have Python, you have a REPL. It's not some weird library you have to download, right? It's not some system-specific thing that's not going to be everywhere. Like if the Python package, right, is on your computer, then you have access to it. And that's really nice, especially if you're just trying to test like really quick things out, right? Being like, I'm going to feed it this hash, and then I'm going to see what happens when I pull this hash back out of memory, out of like CPython, or out of if I'm translating this to JavaScript or whatever, and this hash is going to come back out in different ways because the
Ooh,
sort
yep.
order is different, because the pointer management is different, and just being able to like hone in directly on that without having to worry about setting up a development environment to answer one question is so powerful.
Yeah, I have a talk on memory management in Python, and it's called pointers in my Python. And yeah, while I was writing it, the number of times I just fired up a terminal to be like, oh, just give me a random memory address. Let me just double check that this thing is what I think it is. Oh, let me see if I can create a cyclic isolate with only one element. Stuff like that. Like that was a question I got after one of the times that I gave the talk. Somebody said, oh, you've in your example, you've got a cyclic isolate with 2 elements. Could you do it with 1? And I was like, you know what? I don't know. Let's find out. And you can just do that. One thing that is still an ongoing site of improvement in the Python world is the packaging. How do you distribute, once you've written something that you want to distribute as a package, how do you do it? How do you make sure that the dependencies are going to be the same? Like you've got all these different ways of isolating environments. You've got virtual env, you've got pipenv, you've got things like poetry as well, which I don't actually know a lot about how all of those things work, because I always just use venv and requirements.txt. But I know that there are lots of things like that for more productionized environments and more like big dev teams that need more robust tooling in that. And I know there's not yet single best practices in that world.
Well, the nice thing about virtual env is that as of Python 3, which has been out for a long time, and which everybody is now using everywhere.
2.7
right?
went end of life in 2020.
Everybody
Beginning of 2020,
using Python 3 now. But the nice thing about
oh,
it is
that's not true in enterprise, in industry.
There are
But the nice thing is that
Windows
it's right again. It's standard lib stuff now, right? Whereas with the bad old days, quote unquote, that was the thing you'd have to download, and so you'd have to like pip virtual env. You're like, wait, what? But how do I get virtual env without pip if I can't get pip without virtual env? And then it's all just nastiness all the way down. And then they solved this problem. The nebulous Python world solved this problem. Just going, okay, we're just going to include that. And that one is super convenient, obviously, especially if you're just I just need to whip up a script to do a thing. And even if you do need to do more than that, like you can 100% go to production and deploy containers, in a Kubernetes environment, and virtual env is all you need. That's fine. That's going to work.
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking at containerizing Docker, Django, it was like, yeah, just do it. Like you don't necessarily need to use anything in particular. We've got a comment from No Discard on Twitch saying poetry is awesome. Yeah, I hear lots of my friends advocates of it. So next time I have an excuse, I'll definitely get on that train as well.
Good to know.
Yeah.
No idea.
Yeah. It's one of the things that had happened recently was there was I don't know if this is like an ongoing thing or if there was an uptick in it recently, but malicious packages on PyPy, which is the repository of packages, which is where you can, if you pip install something, that's where it's coming from. In general, you can also, point it at GitHub repo or whatever, but by default. And so I know there was a lot of discussion around sort of the governance of that and how can we ensure that our community sort of resources like that are protected. But I mean, I think that's going to be true in any open source sort of tooling that's as widely adopted as Python is. There's going to be bad actors, and you need to prevent them from doing what they want and protect the people who might be harmed by it.
Yeah, it's the same story with NPM, for instance.
Oh no, I heard. Yeah.
So, yeah, where there's a chance of sneaking malicious code, there will be. So yeah, you need to be real careful, and that may be an issue when you have a dark dependency that's maintained by a couple of people, and maybe the maintainer is tired and just accepts a pull request. And this dependency is a dependency of a dependency of a dependency of a dependency. So you don't know what's going on under the hood. Yeah, that can happen.
Yeah.
Luckily, there are tools.
Some left pad action, right?
Oh yeah, something like that. Although malicious in this case, because left path was just it's gone. Internet's broken, but yeah, it was just broken. But if when you have a malicious dependency that steals your credentials or things like
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
yeah, that's another step. But yeah, there are tools that can analyze your dependencies. So you
Oh,
should try to be
is it
safe.
called safety? There's a tool. I know that the again my previous employer, when they introduced being able to install arbitrary packages into your backend on their hosted service, had a checker, and I think it's called safety, for making sure that all of the things don't have any known security vulnerabilities or anything like that. I'm going to go find out what that's actually called, because it's going to bother me that I don't remember.
So while Eli is looking that up, a couple of things, since we're about halfway mark-ish, we'll use this as a little transition period. Just want to give a couple quick shout outs to some stuff that we know is going on. And the first thing I actually want to shout out is our very own Diego, who is going to be speaking at DevOps Days Caceres in Spain. That's going to be next week, right, Diego?
Next week, Friday and Saturday. So if you
Friday
happen
and
to
Saturday.
be around Spain, I'll see you in Cáceres.
And Cáceres, nice, with that accent and everything. Love it. Diego, for those of us who are maybe not, Iberian Peninsula geography masters, where is Cáceres?
Cáceres is about 3.5 hours ride from Madrid by train. It's kind of between Portugal and Madrid. So yeah,
Cool,
it's
right
kind of
on.
in the middle.
So if you're going to be in the neighborhood, want to learn a little bit about DevOps, want to hang out with some other nerds, that's what's going on. What are you going to be talking about, Diego?
I'll be talking about why people don't want to talk at conferences. So the title of my conference is my talk is why would anyone want to come to my session? I will cover uh, those doubts that you may have about sharing your knowledge. Why should you? Is it worth it? Are you bringing something actually interesting to the table? The answer is yes. Yes, you are bringing something interesting, and yes, people will be interested in listening to what you want to say.
That's definitely an insecurity I have, even after my talk's been accepted somewhere.
Oh
And I
yeah,
have to keep reminding myself, no, the organizers would not have put me on this stage if they didn't think it was worthwhile. But yeah.
Yeah, no,
yeah.
that's the thing. Everybody feels that. I've had the pleasure and the honor of being on stages around the world over the past decade, keynoting in front of thousands of people and stuff like this. And I work with engineers and I work with product people, help train them to do public speaking. And everybody's like, oh, you're very confident. You always seem like you're super comfortable on stage and so on and so forth. And the reality is just I've just learned to suppress that fight or flight response.
For the for the hour that you're on stage, and then afterwards you go and just like have a little meltdown, and then you
Yeah,
come back out and be like,
yeah, you just
yeah,
go
it
to the
was
bathroom,
great.
you have a little cry, right? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I always forget about the adrenaline come down afterwards. I remember one of the last times I was speaking, I sort of did my talk and I felt fine, and then I sat down in the breakout area with a couple of other speakers and I went, oh,
Yeah,
my
your
hand's shaking.
fingers. Yeah.
Yeah.
For
Happens
sure,
to
for
all of
sure.
us.
Hmm.
Speaking of Eli, speaking of you speaking, you're speaking. What's up
I am.
next?
I'm speaking on in 8 days. I'm talking about public betas at DDD Southwest, developer. It's this great series of sort of they're single day conferences that they really feel a lot more like a meetup. They're very community focused, very down to earth. Some really, really great speakers do the ones in the UK, so I feel very honoured to be among that lineup. And the one I'm doing next is in Bristol, and I'm going to be talking about how to run a public beta. Like you've built something, and it's not quite ready for your production. You're not quite ready to call it finished, but it's almost there. And what you really need is user feedback. How do you do that ethically? You're asking users to give you business value, right? In return for using something that might be a bit buggy. How do you genuinely make that worth their while? How do you collect feedback from them? How do you understand that feedback? How do you know when you're done in acting on that feedback? How do you know which bits of feedback to act on? All that sort of thing. How do you make sure your documentation is accurate for the people who are using the public beta versus people who aren't, especially if you're replacing an existing function? So all that good stuff, all the good messy user interaction things. And the main thesis statement of the talk is listen to your users, trust them and respect them.
Those dangerous words.
Oh yeah,
dangerous words.
Yeah. The hot takes here from somebody whose entire job is to care about users.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. All right, so we got those plugs in. Super. We're gonna have a couple more plugs a little bit later on, but let's dive back in. I actually want to pop up some of the comments that we've been getting here in the chat. So thanks to everybody who's in the chat. We love to have you in the chat. We always have people in the community Slack and on Twitter that are interacting, but it's harder to put that into the stream. So if you are on Twitch, you're on YouTube, and you're chatting, it's easier to get you involved, which is really, really cool. So we have, and I'm just going to say it out loud. It looks like Nginx mentioned that they got into Python, and the documentation was so helpful. The Django was really, really good. Discover that framework, and really that's, I think, the heart of a lot of what has made Python and the Python ecosystem so successful is that that concentration, on documentation. And then we had No Discard chimed in talking about poetry. Poetry is awesome, right? Definitely recommends to check it out. And then somebody in the chat asked, why, right? And it's because apparently it downloads dependencies in parallel, and it's worth it just for that, right? So yeah, wow, multi-threading. Who knew that could be so powerful? And I will say this about that. In the modern world that many of us live in, where we've all got, symmetrical multi-gig connections directly into our phones, and we think, oh, you know what, not a big deal, that I just got to clone this 2 gig repo, and it's, who cares, right? That's fine. But I work with a lot of people that are in parts of the world where cloning a 2 gig repo is a thing where you basically turn it on in the morning and walk away and then hope it didn't mess up, right? And downloading dependencies in parallel, that's meaningful, right? Like I realize maybe that the commenter meant it as tongue in cheek, but actually that can be meaningful.
It depends on your dependencies. I mean, I'm thinking about data science things. Some of those can be really big. Some of those can be sort of like you need specific firmware or specific like C dependencies and things like that. I don't know if poetry handles that, but yeah, it can get real messy. And then for things like edge computing, or sort of just Internet of Things, you want to push some updates to like the Raspberry Pis around your home because you've got your home lab set up, and you want to know what temperature it is in the conservatory, so if you open the windows or whatever. I wish I had a conservatory.
I was about to say,
I wish I had a conservatory. I've got a tiny window with all my plants. But and yeah, maybe you do not have that level of bandwidth to all of your devices that still need to be able to handle this data.
I have no idea what a conservatory is.
Oh, it's like a room on the edge of your house that's made of glass, basically, like a greenhouse that's connected to your house, basically. So people have like nice couches in there, nice like throw pillows, plants. Your cat's gonna love it, that kind of thing. It's on the dream checklist for like my forever home because I love plants.
Nice.
And one thing I'd been meaning to set up for ages was Raspberry Pi has a like gardener's home, like keep track of the soil in your plants sort of setup, and like, oh, do you need more zinc in your plants sort of plant food? Do they need watering? All that kind of thing. And there's sort of just kits you can get for that, which is super cool. And it's an example of people using Python to just solve problems in their own home.
Yeah, I think
that's
scratch your own itch
to solve problems. If you're in the chat and you got an IoT gardening plant thing going on, let us know. Eli, I'm super interested. I'm actually broadcasting live from Burgundy right now in my delightfully underfurnished home, and I've got a garden project going on this summer where I'm going to take all the weeds out and make it into an actual garden, and would love to IoT. There you go.
Here's my plants. I've got an
Would love to
avocado
IoT
tree. I've
that.
got an orange tree. I've got some lemon trees that are kind of struggling. One
Nice.
day I will have a conservatory full of plants and a proper Raspberry Pi monitoring setup.
We'll drink tea with our pinky out. It'll be
Oh,
awesome.
absolutely. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that all this new trend of having smart and IoT devices for the rest of us has been popularized by the use of Python, because
And
now
sort of
you don't
having it
have
be
to
open
learn
source as
C
well.
first, right?
Mm,
Yeah, now
yeah.
you can use this language that's doesn't need to compile first. You can just run a script. Didn't work. Okay, try again. Save it. Run it one more time. Okay, there it is. So yeah, that has empowered this new movement, I think, and it has made it easier for folks, including me.
And when we were
Excellent.
talking about getting into Kubernetes, one of the things that we've talked about on NOF is finding projects to scratch your own itch, build something you'll actually use as being a really great entryway into a new technology, and build something that genuinely does something in your own home is a really great avenue for that. And the fact that Python can hook right into that is very, very cool.
Speaking of
Absolutely.
projects like that, I have another one. So I'm lazy and I don't want to mute
You mean
myself
efficient?
clicking in general. Well, yeah, I like efficiency, and I don't want to click on the mute button every single time I want to mute myself. So I created some software mute service in my computer using Python that will basically disable my microphone. So I'm using Linux here. But then another issue appeared here is that I'm always forgetting about my software mute. So I'm just talking whilst I'm muting. So I created a device that turns on an LED, a red LED, whenever I'm muted. And both the service running on my machine and the software running on my microcontroller are running Python. MicroPython on the ESP32, and then regular Python on my Linux service.
Yeah, that's super
It
cool.
works.
Just
Yeah, and I don't
little
have to
quality
do
of
it with
life
C.
stuff. Yeah. I mean, some of the tiny little tools I've built. I want to generate QR codes to put in my slides when I give a talk to the feedback form that I want to build, so that people can be sitting in the audience and giving me feedback right at the end, like during questions or whatever. Python has a module that has a package you can just import called QR code. I want to build. I can do that as a script, no problem. But then it's like, oh, let me just put that on Scaleway serverless functions, write a quick sort of very, very quick and dirty HTML front end that gets served by the function. And it's like, great, now this is just, I can get this from anywhere. I can do this from my phone now. And that, that's not a Scaleway plug. That's just, you can do that with Python. You can do that anywhere. You can put Python on the web.
So Diego, we got a comment in the chat, which I tried to put up, but our platform is munging the comment. So it's from No Discard. Mentions that this is really cool. I hope you open source it. Diego.
Yeah, why
the
not?
The public has spoken. The appetite is there.
Quality is not going to be great, but definitely I will.
That's the great value of open source, is that someone can come along and format it with black and add comments or whatever and be a pedant about I don't know
Honestly,
variable naming or something.
I've been waiting to make it a little bit more professional once Linux is able to support the keyboard command mic mute. So it exists in the kernel, but I don't know how to make it work, how to invoke it through a keyboard. So I've been dabbling around trying to create an HID device, again using a microcontroller that acts as a keyboard and then simulates the pressing of that mic mute key. Mm-hmm. I haven't been able to work it out.
Sounds like you're going to have to end up making a pull request to the Linux kernel.
No, it's there. It was done by some guy from Google last year, has been merged
But some of the
in version
plumbing towards the
5.5.
actual is missing,
Yes,
right?
yes, something is missing, and yeah, that's way above my pay grade and my
Or maybe
knowledge.
below in terms of the stack.
Yeah, it's too much for me. But as soon as that's done, it's gonna be as easy as just invoking one key press for a specific action, like muting or turning the volume up or down. That's gonna be another action. So I already have the hexadecimal code associated with that. I have all that I need. I just need my system to understand how to connect those two things.
Hey, I mean, you could put the call out. I bet there is somebody that we know throughout the three of us, or people in the chat potentially know, who actually will be able to tell you what's missing from in the kernel, and if it is a thing that you can currently do, or and it's just really weird to do, or if it is actually waiting for a kernel update.
Yeah, let's work on that.
Put the
But in
call
the
out.
meantime, yeah, I'll prepare a GitHub repo and just release it.
Yep. Open source that bad boy.
I will.
Excellent, excellent. So I actually had another comment here that unfortunately, I'm pretty sure our streaming platform is going to munge again. But it's actually a little bit orders from Nginx, who's talking about a Python package to check pip dependencies. We were talking about pip dependencies earlier, and I did want to call this out because we're talking about coding, we're talking about this and how you do it. And Nginx notes that safety is a great Python package to check pip dependencies for any known vulnerabilities, and it's easy to include in CI. And I'm noticing that it looks like the comments that we cannot put on screen are the ones that get the little smileys and stuff in them. So
it's truncating them.
We're gonna open up a bug report with our streaming platform on that. But in the meantime, please everybody keep commenting however you want, whether we can put it up on the video or not. Chock full of emojis all day long. As far as
I've got Twitch actually open so I can see the comments as they come in.
Yeah, same. That's why I was looking down when I read it. And
but yeah, safety.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that for a moment. One, I've never used safety. Have either of you?
Yeah, it's the package I was mentioning that the previous tool I worked on, Anvil, have included as part of their build pipeline when you import packages into their backend and sort of create your own custom image for the backend. So they've just added that as by default. It will always check whether you have, whether the packages that you are importing have known security vulnerabilities flagged in this big database that the package calls into. And there's something called, I think it's called like unsafe package or something. I have the docs open. There is a insecure package. That's what it's called. Just insecure-package, and you can test that. You can use that to test and see what happens when it does flag something up. And it's I don't actually know how you invoke it because I haven't looked at the docs. I've only used it in the context of Anvil, but it sounds like a very, very good idea if you are regularly updating your dependencies to have that in there just as a guard against.
No, but what happens if safety gets popped? Then what?
Good question. Who watches the watchmen?
Who watches the watchers?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I don't know how often this package actually gets updated versus the database that it calls out to being updated, because that's the source of truth for vulnerabilities. I don't know what security posture that database has. I would hope it's fairly robust. Something for me to go away and look at and see if let me just SQL inject something into there.
Yeah, for now I've been naive and I've been trusting all the dependencies that I'm installing. So yeah, please do let us know how that works, because I would love to include that into my pipeline.
So I just took a look here. Safety, current version 2.3.5 according to PyPy. And this is very interesting, and I want to point this out right here, right now, in front of God and man alike. This is interesting. By default, it uses the Open Python Vulnerability Database SafetyDB, which is, and this is bolded, they're bold, not mine, licensed for non-commercial use only. Fair, right? For all commercial projects, safely must be upgraded to use a PyUp API using the key option. Super. So, two things here that I think would be interesting sort of conversation topics. Uh, one, what constitutes a commercial versus non-commercial, right?
Yeah.
I think, right, if you happen to work for a company and you just want to test this out, is that a commercial usage? Right, so already
If
there,
I'm
we can get
if I'm
into like
using
the
it to
nitty gritty
build,
of it.
yeah, my little feedback form, that is a professional tool that I'm using in my career. Does
Yeah,
that count?
I don't know. I guess so that's the thing. We'd have to dive into the licensing,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
right, and actually, pick that apart and find out. So, okay, fair. We talked about that. That's the arcana of software licensing. So you have to be a particular special type of nerd and or lawyer to be interested in that. And the second thing I wanted to talk about here is the dash dash key option. So this is relatively new, right? If you've been using, PyUp and so on, and pip and all these tools that integrate these projects or integrate these packages into your project. And there's been a lot of talk, especially over the past couple of years, about how can we make open source sustainable, right? And how can we be funding open source projects and what does that mean, right? And I like this implementation, like it passes the sniff test because it's low impact. They're just saying like, look, here's the deal. If you want to use the thing, you buy a key and then you use the key and then that's it,
Mm-hmm.
right? That is low friction.
Yep.
I like that. I like that it's low friction, right? Um, is this nonetheless, like, is this still a good idea though, right? Because it says you can just, use the dash dash key option for commercial projects. It means, okay, you got to put that key somewhere. And if you're doing this in CI/CD, that means you have to start manage key secrets, right? And it adds a layer of complexity
Mm-hmm.
there, which maybe you weren't having before.
I think the idea behind this is that if you are somebody who needs to use that API key, you probably already do have that level of complexity and it just slots right in. It's something that we come up against in developer tooling as well, right? Is how do I make this thing accessible to people and let people try it out, whilst also being a sustainable business? I think there's very similar incentives in each case. It's like you want to be able to continue to exist, and making sure that the points where you need people to part with money are points which make sense for them. In the sense of, if you are a business and you do need this for non-commercial for commercial purposes, you should be okay spending money and you should be okay dealing with that level of complexity. And if you're not, maybe you don't need it. And if you're transitioning to a stage where you do need it, it's probably a complexity cost that you're going to have to eat at some point anyway.
Totally
That makes
agree.
sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there are obviously going to be cases where that doesn't hold, and that's not the flow that somebody's going through. But broadly, I do like that model. I think it makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm inclined to agree.
Mm.
But then of course you have to start asking, well, okay, well, how much does it cost?
That's
Right?
true. Am I going to be paying £100 a month or something for Twitter API access or whatever it was?
So I just looked up the PyUp pricing.
Mhm.
It's 99, I assume, US dollars.
Sure.
The dollar sign could be a number of different types of dollars that are used around the world. We'll probably assume
US
it's US dollars.
centrism. Yep.
For a month for a team size of 1 to 5 developers. And then it goes up to hundreds and then up to multiple thousands.
How are they
as
enforcing that, I wonder?
That's my question.
Mm.
Right? Like, what does that mean? Like, what even does a per seat license mean in the modern era?
I
It's
mean, at my
kind of
last
right.
place, we had the policy that you cannot share a developer account. One developer account should be one person, and you can't have, for example, developers at company name signed up for an account that all of them log into and do their own things. But enforcing that's really hard. And oftentimes what people end up doing is basing it on the trust, like sort of what's the word I'm looking for?
honesty.
Honesty policy.
Yep. Yeah, that's what happens with MIT and GPL licenses. You just hope that whoever is consuming your software is doing the right thing. But if it's closed source code, no one's gonna notice. Maybe when it was a startup of one person, and then it grew until you have 20 developers. One of those 20 developers will say, "Hey, seems like we should not be using this, or we should be paying for this."
Hmm.
So yeah, you're just relying on human beings trying to be good human beings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this was one of the points of discussion around the Docker thing recently, that they walked back of retracting free plans for teams, and one of the things was, okay, what counts as my image being used for, what counts as me being a commercial entity? Is it sort of, if I'm making this thing and it's open source but I'm accepting donations, does that count? If people are doing GitHub has a mechanism for donating to
Yeah.
repositories and to creators. Um, does that count as I am no longer free open source because somebody has paid me for it? It's tricky. It's
Yeah, it is tricky. And these are things that other industries have had a lot longer periods of time to figure out the answers to. It will take, examples nothing to do with technology, and that's like the Screen Actors Guild in the United States. So, for example, if if you appear in commercials, or you in movies, television programs, so on and so forth, right? You can become a member of the SAG, the SAG, and they have very, very specific guidelines and requirements
mhm,
that are like, if this then that, if this then that, and if you meet a certain set of conditions, a certain set of criteria over a given time period, and so on and so forth, that's like legally extremely well defined,
mhm,
then you are effectively automatically a member, right? You gain the rights and privileges of the Screen Actors Guild, and the rights and privileges effectively mean unionization and guaranteed wages, and so on and so forth, right? Which is really cool. But here's the thing that's been around, since the post-war period. I've had a lot longer time to figure it out,
mhm.
right? Open source. I mean, okay, we can argue about how long open source has been around, and believe me, we all will argue about that. But if we kind of think, back to the in the 90s, when you had Bill Gates, who was at that time the head of Microsoft, declaring open source to be the enemy number one, right? I think that's when it kind of hit the big time. So,
Yeah.
as an industry, we've only had a couple of decades, basically, to be thinking about this problem. And those couple of decades have not been spent solely on thinking about this problem.
And those have been 2 decades of late stage capitalism, which is not conducive to these kind of models.
Yes.
If you are sort of working your 58, 60-hour week just to scrape by, even as a developer, some places are like that. Some places the cost of living is like that. And then you're spending your evenings working on something for free. How do you justify spending that time, even if it is going to be unpaid, when you could be doing gig work or
Yeah.
spending time doing other things that are not that? Um, how do you make that sustainable? And some of the
I,
places there are companies that have full-time open source developers. You can sort of be hired on to do full-time work on open source things full-time. I think those are few and far between, to my understanding.
Extremely rare. I've had
Yeah.
the pleasure of working at two such companies over the course of my career. The first
Cool.
was at, yeah, oddly enough, the first was at Mozilla.
Right.
So, as you can imagine, there were any number of engineers who were paid to work on open source projects, right? Not just the Firefox web browser, although that was a major one at the time and remains probably the largest one that Mozilla still works on now, but a whole bunch of other stuff, right? That is still used all over the place, back end, front
Thunderbird.
end, et cetera, et cetera. What's that?
Thunderbird. I hear
Thunderbird.
it.
I didn't want to say Thunderbird out loud, but there it is.
People are
Exactly.
working on Thunderbird again. Like
Yeah,
it's being revamped.
it has been actually. No, it's a really good little mail client. You
Mm.
should check it out. And the second one is actually fairly recently, was at Datadog. The percentage of people paid to work on open source projects at Datadog is vanishingly small, but not zero. So I think that's probably a bit more representative of of how that actually works in late stage capitalism.
Mm.
But definitely. But I think the numbers of people who can say I make a living writing open source software is basically 0.
Like sort of rounds to 0.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It sort
rounds
of
to
reminds
0.
me of
Yeah.
the other career that I considered when I was sort of starting, like choosing where to go to university, was a classical musician. And full-time salaried positions as a classical musician, similarly, it's like that's the holy grail. You get one of those, you hold on to it for life. And that's the vibe I get from the full-time open source positions, is that you get to do this thing that you love and have it be your job. But very, very, very few people get to do that. And everyone else kind of has to figure it out and scrape together money to keep it going however they can, whether that's by working a full-time job elsewhere or, doing things like, okay, you need to pay for a key.
I can mention an example of the other side of things. I once worked for a startup that all of a sudden decided to add a new clause to our contracts for developers that said any type of software that you develop while you have a contract with us belongs to us.
I know someone who didn't take a Google job because of a very similar clause. Yeah.
Yeah. They didn't actually put it there because we all complained about it. It was
That
my
when you get
early
contracts,
early
I don't know if this
stages.
is true. In the UK, it's true. You get a contract in paper, you can just cross things out and then sign it, and it doesn't count. The thing that you crossed out doesn't count. I've never had to use that, but I every time I get a new contract, I think about it.
You have your pen ready.
Yeah, my red pen.
I have 100% done that in contract negotiations, where I'm just like, nope, 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 nope. And not only can you cross things out, you can just write your own things in. You could just straight up
add an
do
extra
that.
0 to the end of your salary.
Here's the thing.
If they don't notice,
if they take it, they sign it, it's legally binding. So
you might not. They might find a reason to get rid of you a couple months in, but you'll be making bank until then.
But I mean, at the end of the day, right? Like this, you're being handed a contract, a legally binding document, and that's an agreement. It's bidirectional, right? The idea is that this is a formalized agreement between the two parties, and the whole legal language that goes around that. But man, if you're out there and you're getting a job and you're just thinking to yourself, oh, whatever's in here, I guess is fine, I'm not going to read it. Man, you got to read that stuff. Don't be afraid to negotiate. And by negotiate, I mean cross stuff out and write in the stuff you want, because it works.
Nowadays,
this is when I'm thinking about Sorry, go on.
Yeah, nowadays with PDF files may be harder or easier.
Firefox is going to have in-browser PDF editing soon, if not already. They're working on that.
Already, yeah. If you're on Nightly, you've been doing it for a while already.
But I mean, this is one of the things where when I say late-stage capitalism is not conducive to an open source model, it's like that's completely not available to people writing open source. You are writing this software, and the people who you're writing it for have made no promises to you. And how do you make that sustainable? Yeah, it is an unsolved problem. I don't think we're going to solve it today, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, this is probably out of scope for us today. But if you are interested in learning more about hacking capitalism, there is a book you might like to read called Hacking Capitalism.
Yes, by Nova. Yes, it's been on my reading list for ages. Well, since she released it. So
definitely check that out. Chris Nova, Hacking Capitalism. Chris Nova, now of the Nivenly Foundation, I think currently also employed at GitHub, if I'm not mistaken. Definitely check that out. Super interesting. Got an interesting community around it as well. So definitely check that out. And speaking about, we're talking about conversations and having these conversations and diving into these thorny things. Let's transition to talk about the next couple of plugs we have before we call it a day. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that you may right now be at KubeCon. You're probably not if you're joining us today, but if Kubernetes is something that you are interested in, we here at Scaleway, we actually have a meetup series called Cube Talks or Kuba Talks, or however you want to pronounce it. Like, that's your jam, don't worry about it. And we're going to be having our next edition on 27 April. So if you happen to be physically in Paris and you want to come through and check it out, just search for Cube Talks or go to scaleway.com/events. That works fine. /en/events maybe. Anyways, you're computer people, you'll figure it out. And that's on 27 April here in Paris. We talk about Kubernetes. The only hitch, and it's a little hitch, is that the talks are going to be all in French. So il faut parler français. And if you don't speak French, you know what? Come through anyway. I'll have a beer with you. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Je parle
Also, speaking
seulement
of
un peu français. Je
Just look for
parle
us, yeah.
plutôt in French.
There you go. And if you're playing the home game, you know that I like to say if it's your jam. And I like to talk about jams so much that I named the whole meetup series the Jam. So this is the meetup series that I host here in Paris. We're going to be doing our sixth edition, seventh edition, something like that, coming up next month. And this is where we basically just invite interested people to be in the same place at the same time and ask them dumb questions. And then we see what happens. So sometimes we do some fireside chats, sometimes there's a little presentation, but the whole idea is it's super interactive. The whole audience gets in on the conversation. There's a whole networking afterwards. It's really, really cool. So once again, if you happen to be in Paris next month, 23 May, come through, check it out. Just search for the Jam Scaleway, hit enter on your favorite search engine, and you'll find that as well. So Cube Talks, the Jam. We got also
Jamais en français?
Jamais en français. Yeah, that's it. Actually,
No,
so the
is
Jam's
it?
all in English.
Ah,
The Jam's all in English.
Important
Unlike Cube
detail.
Talks, which is in French, the Jam's all in English. So come one, come all. And just a reminder, Diego's going to be at DevOps Days in Spain next week. And Eli's going to be at DDD Southwest in Bristol also next week. And if you're interested in hanging out with me, I didn't put up a little banner on there, but I'm going to be chilling out for the rest of the month. But next month, there's a good chance I'll be at Dev Days in Vilnius. So if you're also going to be at Dev Days in Vilnius next month, come hit me up. We'd love to meet you.
And if not,
Any last
we'll
words,
have
Diego?
another Scaleway Sessions coming up.
if
another
Kubernetes
Scaleway
is your
session.
thing, and you're not in Paris, tune in to our YouTube, our Twitch at the same time next week. It will be pre-recorded. We will not be live because we will doing things. But we're going to be talking to Arthur Busser. Busser? I actually didn't check how you pronounce his surname.
Arthur Busset.
Arthur Busser. Cool.
French.
Who's very cool, very interesting. He's going to be our Dr. Kube for this month. Kuba? Kube.
Dr. Kuba.
Dr. Kuba.
And it
So yeah,
seems like
so-
we can speak about Python a bit more. So maybe another session in the future about Python, because there's a lot of things that I had on my list here that I wanted to ask you folks that I didn't go over. So yeah, are you interested in that? Let us know through the comments. Send us an email. That you have Dan's email probably, or send us a Twitter message, or anywhere you can find.
Hit us up on Twitter.
Relations@scaleway.com. You can find us there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That works too.
Mhm.
Developer-relations@scaleway.com. That gets to all of us. If you want to talk more about Python, let us know. If you want to talk about something else,
Elixir.
let us know. I mentioned Elixir a little while ago. If anybody wants to talk about Elixir, I'd be happy to see what's good, because I haven't touched it in years. So if you happen to be an expert or at least interested in a particular programming language, platform, paradigm, whatever it is, and you'd like to hang out with us on stream, we'd also love to have you. So don't be shy. Dust off the webcam, put your favorite NHL team jersey on, and come hang out with us next time. And until next time, on behalf of the developer relations team here at Scaleway, thank you so much to everybody in the chat. Thanks everybody on socials for checking us out. Super, super appreciate it. Tell your friends, smash the like and subscribe, all the things I'm supposed to tell you to do. And we will see you next week, sort of, and then for sure the week after that. So long, everybody. Thanks for coming out.
See ya.